I was a new student at Southern Lehigh High School in Pennsylvania, going into my junior year of high school. Not knowing anyone was really hard. Everyone seemed to have their friend groups sorted out by then. But the worst part was lunch. My school wouldn't let juniors go out for lunch, only seniors, so I had to eat in the cafeteria. I was dreading it because I knew I wouldn't have anyone to sit with, and I didn't want to force my way to a random table. But when lunchtime finally arrived, I walked into the cafeteria with my tray of food looking for a place to sit. Every single table was taken. I couldn't even sit alone. But there was a table in the corner of the cafeteria with only 2 kids sitting at it. It was the least intimidating place to sit, so I went over and asked if I could sit there. They both looked at each other and one of them said, "Yes." As I sat down, I noticed that they were identical twins. They looked like they were part Hispanic, but they didn't have any accents. They really seemed fine. They introduced themselves as Antonio and Bruno and struck up a conversation with me. They invited me to hang out with them after school, and honestly, I thought, why not? I had to start somewhere to make friends. I got their numbers and went home after school to drop off my stuff. Shortly after, I got a text from Bruno telling me that he and his brother wanted to hang out. He told me to meet them around 9 that night at the nearby cemetery, which was about a 10-minute walk from my house. He said it was a cool place to hang out, and the first day of school was on a Friday, so we had the next day off. I had nothing to do, so I said, "Yeah, I'll be there." When the time came, Bruno texted me again and asked if I was still coming. I said, "Yeah, I'm leaving in a few minutes," and confirmed that we would meet on the street by the cemetery. He said yes, so I started walking in the dark to the cemetery. The longer I walked, the more I thought about moving and being the new kid in high school. I thought about the fact that I was literally walking to a cemetery at night to hang out with 2 kids I just met. Anyway, I got to the little street next to the cemetery and asked Bruno where they were. He started typing right away and said they were in the woods hanging out by a little lake that they wanted to show me. Then he immediately sent his location. So I made my way into the woods, pushing branches out of the way and using my tiny cell phone flashlight as my only light. I started calling out for Bruno and Antonio as I felt I was close enough, at least according to the location he sent me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, so I stopped. Definitely footsteps coming towards me. They were very deep and slow. I shouted that they better not try to scare me. Well, they didn't answer me. I decided this was stupid. I turned around and started walking back toward the road. Those footsteps I mentioned earlier, they went from quiet and slow to fast, and before I could even react, someone had their nails digging into my neck, effectively strangling me. I heard a familiar voice yell, "Get her! Grab 'em!" I managed to free myself from the kind of chokehold and sprinted toward the road. I know they followed me to the tree line by the road. I was faster than them, and I could run for miles, and that's what I did. I ran straight home and told my parents. They considered calling the police, but I thought it would be better to take pictures of the nail marks on my neck and report it to the school the next day. That's what we did, and with the help of the text I got from Bruno, I was able to get the 2 students expelled. My parents made me block their numbers. I didn't really argue with them. My parents wanted me to confirm that these kids didn't know where we lived, and I just told them, not to my knowledge. Anyway, one night about a week later, I woke up in my room feeling really cold. I heard the sound of wind blowing into my room, and I looked at the window and saw that it was wide open. I wondered if my mom had come in to open it, but that would make absolutely no sense. It was like 50 degrees outside that night. I walked over to it and looked down. A few feet below my bedroom window, there's a part of the exterior of my house that comes out, creating a kind of ledge under my window that my father always told me to jump onto in case of fire. I closed my window and walked over to my parents' bedroom. I knocked gently and opened the door, and my mother groggily asked what I had to ask her if she opened my window. She sat up and said, "No, why?" I told her in a louder, more concerned voice now that someone had opened my window all the way. She started shaking my dad to wake him up and go check my room with me. But when he woke up, he told me to grow up and go back to sleep. I left my parents' door open as I walked back down the hall to my room, and I noticed something that I'm surprised I noticed. My door. It seemed to be half closed now, as opposed to being completely open when I left. I pushed the door open just a little so I could look through the crack and see if, someone was behind the door. Even though I had thought of the possibility, I could never have expected to see it. Someone was hiding behind my door. I screamed for my father like a little girl. I screamed so loud I'm sure it could be heard 3 doors down, and my door suddenly slammed shut just as my dad ran out of his room and over to me. I yelled, "There are people in my room!" So he burst into the room and turned on the light. That is when we saw a person's leg jump out of my window. My father ran to the window, then downstairs and out the front door to try to chase them. But he came back a few minutes later, out of breath, saying he hadn't seen anyone. Full of energy and fear, my sword had to be those twins I had expelled. My father called the police and I had to talk to them when they arrived, explaining the whole story back to the incident in the woods. My dad backed up my story, but without proof of who came in, they said there wasn't anything they could do. They simply ordered us to lock the doors and consider installing cameras outside. As sure as I am that it was either one or both of those twins in my room, after a couple of months of sleeping in fear, nothing like that ever happened again. Looking back now, I don't know why I was so willing to meet those kids in the woods at night. I should have realized in the cafeteria that day that they looked like trouble, and I should have stayed away. Tell him to ask for my combination again. I figured maybe the combination had slipped my mind for some reason. The sub told me to give him a few minutes and he'd get the list of locker combinations. I waited outside the office, and he finally came out with a book in his hands open to a certain page. He walked into the girls' locker room with me, which I hadn't expected. The locker room was basically empty now, with one girl finishing changing. He walked over to my locker and tried the combination written on the paper. It didn't work, no matter how many times he tried. Every time he tried and failed, he looked at me and laughed. I forced myself to laugh along, to be polite. When it started to get weird, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll figure it out." He tried the combination again with his hand still on my shoulder, and it didn't work again. I felt his hand slowly move down from my shoulder to my lower back. I pushed myself away and grabbed my bag and said, "It's okay, I'm late for my bus." He tried the combination in the locker again, and it opened. He smiled and walked away. I waited until I heard the locker room door close and was quickly getting dressed when the room suddenly went dark. I finished pulling up my pants and pushed my locker shut in the dark. I threw on my backpack and started walking to the back exit of the locker room, which led outside. I was afraid the sub would be waiting for me at the door. I was getting predatory vibes from him. When I got to the end of the particular aisle of lockers I was in, I was at the intersection of 2 rows. I had to turn left to get to the exit door, but of course I had to look to the right to make sure it was clear. There was a little light coming from a single rectangular window under the ceiling. It was enough for me to see him peering at me from behind the wall of lockers. That's when I ran for the exit door. He came up behind me and said, "Wait, wait, wait!" It's not what it looks like. I ran out into the rain off the high school campus and walked the rest of the way home, which gave me time to think about what had happened. By the time I got home, soaking wet, it occurred to me that he had probably somehow changed my locker combination in order to get alone with me in the locker room. As for what he might have been up to when he turned off the lights, I never wanted to imagine. Honestly, I was too emotionally scarred and, quite frankly, embarrassed to tell anyone about it, not even my parents or friends. It was something I just kept to myself all these years because, honestly, I just don't feel comfortable telling people. When I was in high school, I was in band, and my school band was basically an easy A. It was either that or orchestra or choir, so I chose band. Anyway, our band teacher, Mr. Nicholson, had the grading system set up so that as long as you attended class and went to your weekly lessons, you got an A. I was more than happy with that because, realistically, I would probably just be playing games on my phone instead of actually practicing. The next day, I arrived at the music room during my lunch break, so I took my saxophone and went down the stairs outside the music room to the music department's basement. It was always kind of creepy down there because no one but the music teachers usually went down there, and the lights were kind of shitty. I had only been down there a couple of times before that day. Anyway, I walked down the hallway, and on either side were a bunch of doors that led into little rooms, maybe 7 by 7 feet. All of these rooms were used to store things like chairs, music stands, backup instruments, Christmas decorations, and whatever. I went into one of the rooms and closed the door. I set up my music on one of the stands in the room, just in case Mr. Nicholson came down to check on me. But I wasn't really planning on playing. I started playing games on my phone and then flick. Darkness, like as dark as it could get. My phone screen. I looked over to the light switch in the room, just instinctively flipped it up and down a few times, but that did nothing. I stumbled as I stood up to open the door to more darkness. I held my phone out in front of me to light up this little hallway, even if it was just barely. I think I had an iPhone 3 or something. The old ones didn't have flashlights. Anyway, that little light from my phone was enough to see one of the doors at the end of the hall open, and I heard something being dragged into that room, like one of those big plastic containers. There was also manic breathing, followed by animal-like grunting. Then I saw a large plastic container being pushed out of that room into the hallway. When I saw this, I turned off my phone screen. I walked back into the room I had just been in. I closed the door so quietly. I don't know exactly what I was thinking at that moment when I decided to hide, but I think the strange sounds I heard from that person, mixed with a random blackout, made me wary of staying in that hallway. Whoever it was blocking the stairs, and of course I had no reception down in that little basement area. All I could do was sit in that room and wait for the lights to hopefully come back on. But the lights didn't seem to be coming back on, so I decided to try to get back upstairs. I quietly opened the door, holding my phone in front of me for light. Then I stepped out into the hall. I crept a little closer to the stairs and heard something again. I quickly crept into the next room with the door open and closed it. I still didn't know what I was hiding from. Could it have been a staff member or a janitor? At that point, the only reason I had for thinking it wasn't was that they only appeared down there after the lights went out. I was standing in that room in total darkness, just listening and waiting for another sound from outside. But you know how, when you're in a room with somebody, even if you can't necessarily hear them, you can kind of just feel their presence. That's what I suddenly felt as I stood in that pitch-black room. I raised my trembling hand and pressed the home button on my phone to turn on the screen for just half a second. That was enough for me to see someone standing in the corner of this small storage room, 3 feet away from me. I pretended I didn't see anything, but it was too late. That's what I heard, breaking the silence. Then a hand tapped me twice on the shoulder and began to squeeze. I basically dove for the doorknob, struggling to find it at first, but pulling the door open when I did. The man in the room with me tried to push the door shut after I opened it, but I was already out. I ran up the stairs and out the door to the main level of the music hall where the lights were still on. I ran to Mr. Nicholson to tell him, out of breath. He called security to check the basement of the music hall, but security came back upstairs and said that, except for some music equipment being moved around, there was no one down there. For the rest of the time, Mr. Nicholson canceled his flute class, and I sat in the room with him and 5 flute players and explained the whole story in detail. Without cameras in the music hall, there was no way to catch whoever went down there and cut the power to the basement. It looked like he was trying to steal expensive music equipment and who knows what else. The next day, I was called into the dean's office to tell my story, and the rest is history. One night, my friends and I came up with a brilliant plan. We were going to sneak into the basement of the high school through one of the windows that was broken and never fixed. The thing about this window was that you had to jump over a short metal gate that surrounded the outside stairs leading down to the basement. Not that it would effectively stop anyone, but it added that extra barrier that made you feel like you were doing something really devious when you went over it. We made sure there weren't any security cars nearby and jumped the gate. Crawling in through the window proved difficult, considering we had to lift ourselves up and then crawl through an insanely narrow opening. But once in, we were in. We kind of spread out to explore different areas. One thing was for sure. The basement of the school was a mess and anything but interesting. There was little light. A small white light was on in a far corner, and the light from the exit sign actually produced more light than you'd think. I looked around when I saw one of my friends standing in front of me. He whispered, "Let's go upstairs." So I followed him upstairs. He opened the door to the main hallway of the school. Everything was dark. I always thought there would be at least some lights on in the school at night, but no, not a single light was on. All that really stood out as far as the eye could see were the various exit signs glowing red. I followed my friend down the hall and remembered saying, "Dude, this is really creepy." And he responded. But I realized that he was right. Who knew if there was anyone else in the building besides my friends and me? Little did I know. I followed my friend to the bathroom and he went into one of the stalls. I whispered, "Hurry up." I waited a while, and then my phone started ringing. I picked it up, and it was one of my friends, Chris. He said, "Where the hell have you been?" I said, "I'm upstairs with either Roland or Brandon." He said, "What do you mean?" "They're with me." And right after that, both Brandon and Roland said hello, apparently on speakerphone. I stuttered the word "me" and stopped, trying to think straight. Then there was a laugh coming from the booth. Not the laugh of any of my friends. I looked up at the booth. There was someone looking at me, probably standing on the toilet. I screamed, "Holy!" over and over into the phone as I left the bathroom. Shortly after I was outside, I heard the stall door slam shut. I tried to run back to the basement in the dark, but it wasn't easy to find it in the dark. Luckily, I managed to find them, so I started screaming their names as I ran down the stairs. When they answered, I yelled, "Go, go!" And we jumped, one by one, out of what looked like a bucket onto the window ledge and crawled back outside. I was the first one out, but I was afraid that the person from the bathroom would follow me. Once we were all outside, I explained to them, out of breath and laughing at the same time, that I now felt safe with them all beside me. I guess we were loud or something, because when we all started looking around at the whole school building and all the classroom windows, there was someone in one of the downstairs windows with their hands pressed up against the glass, so you could only see maybe half of their face. I said, "That's got to be him," as Roland told us to get the hell out of there. We ran until we were off the school grounds, and that was it. We came up with a lot of possible explanations, but none of them really made sense. Of course, we never did anything like that again.